how B-lawns kind of present a solution to some of the lawn issues we may be facing. After that, we'll talk about the elements of a B-lawn, what are the building blocks that make a B-lawn what it is, and then finally, how to install a B-lawn. I did see a chat in there that I'm talking fast. Sometimes my inner New Yorker gets the best of me. I'll try and slow things down here. So the function of the turf grass lawn, or why do we have a turf grass lawn in the first place? And what I tell folks about that is you should really only have a turf grass lawn in areas where you desire recreation, where turf grass, it doesn't bring the most ecological value out of all the different forms of vegetation. But what it does is that it brings something that is especially geared towards foot traffic, where if you want to play ball with the kids or the dog, you want to have an area to gather and play in, a turf grass lawn is going to function much better than a prairie. The Twins are going to take the field here for playoff baseball in just a couple of days. As much as I love a field of bee balm and asters, it's not going to make for quite as nice an outfield as a turf grass lawn does. So in those areas that you're actively using in your yard, that's really where you should be considering using turf grass, or an option that is still going to allow for that kind of foot traffic. And all of those areas that you manage where you don't have as much traffic, where you don't have as much recreation going on, those are areas where you can think of entirely different plantings, those beautiful native prairies and other forms of native vegetation. So even for those of us that really appreciate our turf grass lawns and have some space where we use where we have recreation in our yards, I hope we can all agree that we might have just a little bit too much turf in the United States, where we have about 50,000 square miles of turf in the US. That's more than 3 times the acreage of irrigated corn that we have. And I think it's even more important that we think about where that turf grass is located. Where if you look at the map on your left, those areas in that dark green color indicate where we have the most turf in the United States. You'll see a lot in my neck of the woods, the Northeast United States. You'll see a lot in kind of Southern California, a big splotch of green there. But even if you start to hone in on the Midwest, in the greater Chicago area, and even right here in the Twin Cities, you'll see those big blotches of green, and those indicate high areas of turf grass prevalence. And what I encourage folks to think of is try and critically think about your yard and how you use it. In the spaces that have the most recreation, absolutely keep turf grass present. In those areas that you're not using too much, think about what you can put in there that would have a greater ecological value. So the goal of the bee lawn is to kind of take those areas that we are actively using, that we want to keep as a spot for foot traffic, and kind of increase the ecological value of it. So we take that traditional turf grass lawn, we add in low-growing pollinator-friendly flowers, and create a matrix of grasses and flowers that still provide the traditional values of turf in terms of aesthetics and the potential for recreation, but include flowers that are known to provide high ecological value, high nutritional value to our at-risk pollinators. You'll often hear these referred to as flowering lawns or bee lawns or pollinators, but it's really anywhere where we start to integrate low-growing pollinator-friendly flowers into the turf grass lawn. So the goals of a bee lawn are threefold. We want them to be low maintenance, we want them to protect our pollinators, and we want them to improve water quality. And it's at this point that I always try to remind folks, this is by no means a replacement for a native planting or a prairie. This is simply an eco-friendly enhancement to your traditional turf grass lawn. So in those areas where you were considering installing something native and native prairie, go ahead and do that. But if you wanted to make turf grass areas of your yard work a little bit better for the environment, for the pollinators, for wildlife, this is something great to consider. So I'll say low maintenance and low input quite a bit throughout this presentation, and there are 3 main characteristics when it comes to vegetation that would make them low maintenance or low input. One is drought tolerance. I used to have to talk about this a whole lot more when it used to rain in Minnesota, but that has been a thing of the past, at least for the past 3 years here. But essentially, drought tolerance is tied to how frequently you need to irrigate your yard. If you have plants with deep root systems, you can go weeks, if not more than a month, without irrigating and be totally fine. But if you're using plants with short vegetative roots, something like Kentucky bluegrass, where you're lucky if the roots go 6 to 8 inches deep, then you're going to be watering a whole lot. So we're trying to think about how we can bring some drought tolerance to the lawn. We also desire a slow vertical rate of growth. This is directly tied to how frequently you're mowing. Most people don't realize that there are species of turf grass out there that you can mow twice per year and be totally fine. Big Lawn Care doesn't want you to hear that. They want you to think you need to mow every 7 to 10 days, but we'll keep this little nugget between you and I and all your friends and everyone else who wants to have a more eco-friendly solution. And also, we want vegetation with low fertility needs. Those who really care about their lawns, they're probably applying a nitrogen-based fertilizer 2 to 3 times per year. Again, those are based off of the needs of your traditional turfgrass lawn, something that uses Kentucky bluegrass. There are options out there that don't need to be fertilized at all, or maybe they get one very light application of nitrogen per year. So we're going to be thinking about what are these turf options or turf adjacent options that are more low input, more low maintenance, and they check each of these 3 boxes. They're drought tolerant, they grow more slowly, and they have a low fertility need. Pollinator protection, I'd hope, is the most obvious goal of a bee lawn. We are trying to actively invite these at-risk pollinators into our yard by putting in some pollinator-friendly flowers that we know provide really strong nutritional value to bees and other pollinators. This means that they have sugar that's high in nectar content, and pollen that's high in protein content. Nectar that's high in sugar content. I got that one backwards. Bee lawns and stormwater conservation might be the least obvious of the goals. And I hope when all of you look at this picture here, the thing that sticks out like the light bulb moment is, my goodness, that is not what I expected a bee lawn to look like. And you would be exactly right, where this is a beautiful rain garden that was installed by Metro Blooms in Minneapolis. And the reason I include this is because I do a ton of site visits and kind of site assessments with folks. And when they tell me that their first goal, their number one priority is to improve local water quality, reduce the amount of stormwater runoff that comes off of their property, without fail, what I do with that resident is we try to look at how water moves through the property and insert a rain garden smack dab in the middle to capture as much stormwater runoff as possible. That being said, even for a resident that's got oodles of money to spend, if they install a really big rain garden or a series of rain gardens, that's going to cover maybe 1,000 square feet. And the average lawn for the average household in the United States is several thousand square feet. So even if we install a large rain garden or a series of rain gardens, it still leaves thousands of square footage of that lawn area unaccounted for. And that's where we think a bee lawn is a really great supplement to a rain garden and other native plantings when it comes to conserving stormwater runoff, protecting local water quality. And it's all tied to root systems. If you have typical turf grass in that yard area, the roots are very shallow. They're not capturing and infiltrating that much stormwater runoff. Where year over year, when root systems die off, they create pores and cavities within the lawn that really help for infiltration. Bee lawns, the flowers and grasses used there, the root systems are several feet deep. So we're getting more of these pores, more of these cavities throughout the lawn, which really dramatically improves infiltration rates and reduces stormwater runoff. So that kind of covers the why behind why we might want to think a little differently in terms of how we manage our lawns. So now we can think about what actually is a bee lawn. What are the different building blocks here? So we're going to build these bee lawns quite literally from the bottom up, starting first with how we select turfgrass species. For Mike and myself and the others that work at a grass seed company, this might be the sexy part of the presentation. For those of you that are more interested in the bees and flowers, I say just bear with me because I promise, even if it's not the most exciting part, it's super, super important to make a bee lawn work. From there, we'll be talking about the floral species that make a bee lawn, what flowers can actually work within a lawn setting. There's a lot of competition there. There's a lot of stressors to kind of work through, but there are some flowers that work quite nicely. And finally, the part that I think is most fun, the part that was actually the topic of my graduate student research, is who actually visits a bee lawn. So we'll start first by looking at some turf grass. So for decades now at the University of Minnesota, the folks in the turf lab have been asking the question, how can we make the turfgrass lawn more low maintenance? Looking for species that use less irrigation, that don't need to be mowed as frequently, and that don't need nearly as much fertilizer. All of those inputs that I talked about just before. But when we want to think about how can we bring flowers into the lawn, we also have to think about how competitive that turfgrass species is. So for decades, folks have been wanting grass that's really competitive to keep the weeds away. But now we're kind of going the opposite direction, at least when it comes to bee lawns, and saying, hey, flowers, come in here. We don't want to crowd you out. So we're trying to focus on grasses that grow a little bit more slowly and don't have as high of a nutrient requirement. To kind of put a little bit of a pictorial guide to this, if we were to consider a grass species that grows really fast, it would potentially create a canopy over the top of the flowers and limit their ability to establish, where we thought that aggressive grasses would lead to low forb or low floral establishment. Conversely, if we had grasses that grew more slowly, We thought it would give more space to the flowers to settle in and kind of survive and thrive. So the hypothesis there was that less competitive grasses means more forbs establishing within the lawn area. So we actually put this to test. We took the 4 most common species of grasses and threw some flowers in those plots and said, how are you all going to grow together? So we put Kentucky bluegrass, hard fescue, which is a type of fine fescue, tall fescues, and perennial ryegrass in with Kura clover, just a common naturally occurring clover species out there in the wild. And what we found was that the grasses really do make a huge difference in terms of how many flowers that you see. Where the grasses that grow more slowly and don't require as many nutrients, particularly the fine fescues, but also to an extent of the Kentucky bluegrasses, where they were able to have a lot more coexistence with flowers, where we saw about 9 times as many flowers in lawns with fine fescue and Kentucky bluegrass as we did lawns that were planted with perennial ryegrass and tall fescue. A lot of this we believe is due to germination time. Fine fescues and Kentucky bluegrass, they don't just have slow vertical growth, they're slow to germinate. So if a perennial ryegrass is starting to germinate in about 5 days and a Kentucky bluegrass is starting to germinate in about 21 days, it gives a lot more room for those flowers to start growing. Ultimately, when it comes to choosing between the two, the fine fescue and the Kentucky blue, we recommend that folks use fine fescues because they are very, very low input or low maintenance. So a little bit about the fine fescues. If you ever talk to folks at the University of Minnesota's Turfgrass Science Lab, they are going to just gush over this grass species because of how low input it is. It has a very low fertilizer need. I don't think I've ever fertilized a fine fescue lawn, but what's recommended is 0.5 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. To a lot of people, that's going to mean nothing. What's a lot easier to understand is it has 1/6 the nitrogen need as that of Kentucky bluegrass. So in a year, if you're trying to do the absolute most pristine turf maintenance possible, you're still putting down 1/6 as much nitrogen, which is super important because those fertilizers lead to a lot of environmental issues, especially ones with phosphorus in them. They really can lead to lots of algal blooms. When I moved to Minnesota about 7 years ago, I knew it was the land of 10,000 lakes. I just didn't know that more than 50% of them were considered contaminated. So a great way to reduce that contamination, use less fertilizer. And if you want to still have a great lawn while using less fertilizer, fine fescues do a great job. They're super slow growing. These are the grasses I was talking about when I said you can have a beautiful lawn and only mow it 2 to 4 times per year. The rate of growth of the fine fescues is so slow that there are some folks who just don't mow them ever. That can lead to some issues within the lawn, but even still, they'll top out at like 10 to 12 inches. I try to tell folks, if you can mow these just twice per year, you'll have a healthy lawn throughout the entirety of the year, and it'll kind of help with the keeping up with the Joneses of, not making the neighbors lose their mind. Fine fescues work really well in both the sun and the shade. To be frank, all grasses like sun. It's really the shade that's only going to be a limiting factor here. And that's really where fine fescues first kind of came to prominence. Kentucky bluegrass is by far the most common turf species used in the US, but it does not like shady areas. People started using these because they thrive in the shade. So if you're looking for something for that shady part of your yard, the fine fescues are great there as well. And what's probably most exciting to me on the conservation side of things is the drought tolerance of the fine fescues. By a show of hands, who has struggled in their yard trying to keep their grass green through the droughts of the past few years? I would say we've got about half the people raising their hand. So Kentucky bluegrass, the recommendation is to water it 2 to 3 times per week. With the fine fescues, the watering recommendation is to water it once every 2 to 3 weeks. So you can imagine just how dramatic a impact that can make. But you don't really have to use their imagination since I'm out there reading all the very boring turf grass research papers that are out there. A paper from about 5 years ago found that low input lawns have about 1/3 the environmental footprint, the carbon footprint, as your typically maintained lawn. Yeah. So if you want to do something super easy in your yard that's good for the environment, if you use grass species B, the fine fescues, instead of traditional turf grass, Kentucky bluegrass, you can have 1/3 the carbon footprint when it comes to management. I think that's about as easy as it gets. You don't have to sell me too hard to do less yard work when it's beautiful out here in Minnesota. The one negative that we really see with the fine fescues is they don't have fantastic traffic tolerance. You can still have, light recreation on it, out there hanging out, doing some light activities. But if you want a yard where you could really tear it up, playing soccer and sports with the kids and all that, then you might want to incorporate a little bit of tall fescue or Kentucky bluegrass. Not get rid of the fine fescue altogether, but just add in a little bit of a grass species that has stronger traffic tolerance. Snow mold, if you live in Minnesota, you've probably dealt with it. It's that kind of moldy discoloration that kind of comes in at the onset of spring here. It is a little bit more prone to snow mold, the fine fescues are, but give your lawn a light raking at the start of spring and it'll go away in no time. So now that we know the turf grasses that are best suited for a bee lawn, we can talk about the flowers that we can use within a bee lawn. So this is the work of Ian Lane. He was a grad student that came before me at the University of Minnesota, and his goal was to find floral species that will, one, tolerate lawn management practices. This really means, what can we mow the heck out of and have it still come back? Or even if I tell folks that we're only trying to mow 2 to 4 times per year, there are those people who are just stuck in their ways and want to mow whatever their regular cycle is, maybe once every 2 weeks. So we needed flowers that can tolerate and continue to bloom after a mowing event. So don't think that just because you see these flowers blooming in your beautiful bee lawn that we're all going to have 12 months from now, don't think that means you can't mow it because you see flowers in bloom. These will bounce right back. We have one planted right outside our storefront at Twin City Seed. It gets mowed 3 or 4 times a year. Flowers bounce right back. You would never know that they were gone. We try to use only flowers that serve as high quality food for bees. There are other flowers that can do well within a lawn setting. An example of that would be Creeping Charlie, the bane of every Minnesota gardener's existence. And while it is very present in lawns and bees visit it, it doesn't really provide high quality nutrients for bees. It doesn't make pollen available to bees, so no protein coming at them. And it uses this really neat reward distribution method called the jackpot method, where some of the flowers have no nectar, some of the flowers are just blooming with nectar. I kind of like to call it the pull tabs of flowers, where the vast majority of flowers got nothing in them. But my God, when they get to that flower that's just bursting with nectar, they're like, better reinvest in 100 more pull tabs. But we all know, anyone that's been to the bar, pull tabs are not the safest way to invest your money. And Creeping Charlie is not the most consistent flower for a bee to visit. So we'd rather put flowers out there where there's no pull tabs involved. You visit the flower, you get some nectar, and you continue on with your day. We also try to incorporate as best we can native flowers into a bee lawn. Any of you who have been up to your reading in the world of planting for pollinators, you probably know that the most consistent sources of forage are native flowers. Bees and other pollinators have co-evolved alongside natives for literally millions of years. That being said, it was something that was a little bit more difficult than we initially anticipated. In the original bee lawn trials, all but 2 flowers that were tested were natives. Only one of them thrived. Every single one of the non-native flowers tested, which was only 2, thrived within the setting. So the original bee lawn mix has 1 native flower and 2 non-natives. What I'll say about those non-natives is not all non-natives are invasive. Every non-native flower used in a bee lawn mix will not outcompete the natives in your yard and garden, and they will be very attractive to pollinators while providing them with high quality forage. So these are flowers that are not going to be an issue. If anything, they are a massive ecological benefit. So the first flower that we've had some great success with is Self-Heal. Self-Heal is this beautiful little native purple flower. I've actually seen it at a lot of Minnesota state parks, which is exciting to me as a nerd. And they've got these beautiful, what's called a whorled bloom. So when I say a whorled bloom, it's kind of talking about how the petals come together. So rather than being isolated and kind of branching off, they kind of I don't know what the proper way to term it. They kind of create a floral neck in the flower. So instead of that floral neck being wide open, those petals kind of collapse on each other and create a long floral neck. So if any of you are looking for a little entomology lesson, the corolla length, the neck of the flower, is directly correlated with how big of bees you would expect to see using it. If you've got a long floral neck, that means you need a long bee tongue to get in there and get your rewards. So we expected to see mostly large bees on this flower. What's really neat about this flower from a gardening perspective is you can get just about any flower to grow in full sun. This is a flower that actually does really well in full sun and shade alike. So when folks tell me that they want something for their lawn that's going to bloom and provide forage for bees and beauty in a shady area, this is the #1 flower that comes to mind for me. Creeping Thyme, what's beautiful about this flower is outside of its value to bees even, is its drought tolerance. If you're looking for something that you would never have to water once throughout the year, creeping thyme could practically survive in a desert. It has exceptional drought tolerance. It also has great winter hardiness. Living here in Minnesota, don't have to get too deep into that one. Out here, where we're a little bit in a maybe more rural area than I'm used to, I bet a lot of us, at least some of us, struggle with deer getting into our garden, eating our plants, eating our tomatoes, the like. Creeping thyme does actually function a little bit as a deer deterrent. They don't like the taste and the scent that's associated with the vegetation. Very similar to the thyme you use in your cooking. So it's not the same species as your cooking thyme, but it is from the same genus. People will sometimes ask me, how can you tell thyme apart from other flowers with similar vegetation? If you run your fingers through the vegetation of creeping thyme or mow it, it will light up your entire lawn. It is really quite enjoyable on the days when we mow that bee lawn out in front of campus, in front of the storefront. It smells incredible. Dutch white clover. This is one where the beauty of the flower is simply just the diversity of bees that it attracts. I'll talk more about that later. It also provides really high quality nutrition for your pollinators. It's got some nectar that's super high in sugar content and pollen that's really high in protein content. Dutch white clover is like a staple of the nutrition of the honeybee. While it's a European species going to a European flower, that doesn't impact the nutritional quality of the flower. If you think about broccoli, is still broccoli, whether it's grown in Europe or the United States in terms of its nutritional quality. The same goes for the nutritional quality of this flower, where no matter what, nectar that's high in sugar content is good for bees, and pollen that's high in protein content is good for bees, even if it's coming from a non-native flower. What's really great for your lawn when it comes to Dutch white clover is that it's a nitrogen-fixing flower. It's from the legume family. That means is it takes that atmospheric nitrogen, fixes it back into the soil, and makes it readily available to pollinators. No nitrogen fertilizer necessary. Common violet is a beautiful one that's naturally occurring in the yards of lots of folks. It's not readily available from seed. You might be able to get a small seed packet of it. And if you want to add a little bit more color to your yard, I encourage you to do so. What I normally tell folks is if you have violet in your yard, lucky you, keep it there. Don't hit it with a pesticide. It's really useful to pollinators. It also looks really beautiful. I don't know how we ever became convinced that a green monoculture is more desirable in a lawn than a lawn full of color and life and beautiful flowers. So just my 2 cents there. I know it's very subjective, but I also know that chemical companies have a lot of sway in terms of how people perceive things. So I try to punch back as best I can, even if it's me throwing jabs and them throwing right hooks. So finally, who visits a bee lawn? This is all worthless unless we know that bees are actually visiting these flowers. And this is actually what I had the luxury of studying during my grad student days. So who visits a bee lawn? So with the self-heal, we saw at least partially what we expected. We saw tons of big, chunky bumblebees on these flowers, where you could see them kind of on the landing pad of the flower, sticking its long bee tongue into the flower, getting its nectar, getting its pollen. And that was probably about 50% of what we saw on the self-heal flower, where we also saw some teeny tiny little bees. And this was quite the surprise, where we knew they didn't have a long enough bee tongue to just hang out on the flower and grab their food. What they actually did was very, very cute. They would crawl into the flower, down that floral neck I talked about earlier, grab their nectar and pollen and fly away. What it was is it's a whole lot more difficult to observe because now you have to peel open every flower looking for bees. But we did that and we found a great diversity of these smaller bees, probably about 15 different species of these teeny tiny little solitary bees that were using this flower as a source of nectar and also as a source of protein. So has anyone here heard the term generalist and specialist when it comes to pollinators? So I think everyone, or most people in this kind of gardening space have heard that. What I don't think a lot of people know is that it only applies to how you collect your pollen, where pretty much all pollinators will visit just about any flower when it comes to gathering nectar. So knowing that a flower is a nectar source, it's great, but it's not quite as exciting because it doesn't answer the question of, is this providing value to our specialist bees? So the fact that we saw bees foraging for protein, foraging for pollen on this flower was super exciting. It also raises the question, James, how did you figure this out? And sometimes you just have to watch the bees' behavior. We can't do every single aspect of science behind a computer. We still have to actually do some work out in the field. And here, this is just a simple video taken on my iPhone, but it is super exciting to me. So any of you that have bees, honeybees that is, or know a beekeeper might be familiar with what's called combing behavior. But all that is it's when the bee uses its legs to brush pollen down through its hairs, down into its pollen sacs. We got one person who knows what I'm talking about here, at least. And if you watch the video, you could see some clear legs really moving really hard, brushing that pollen down into the pollen sacs. So because we saw that combing behavior, and we saw those pollen sacs chock full of full of pollen, we knew that this flower wasn't just a source of nectar, but also a source of protein, meaning that it was providing some value for native specialist bees, where this bee here, Bombus bimaculatus, is a native bee. So we got a native bee foraging for pollen, a lot more exciting and from a conservation point of view than just a bee going out grabbing some nectar. You don't have to work too hard to convince a kid to eat an ice cream cone, but if you wanted to get some protein, some high quality nutrition, it's exciting when you finally get them to eat that chicken breast or something along those lines. So self-heal, if there's one takeaway that I want you to have about that flower, it's that more than 95% of the visitors we saw in self-heal were native species. Those natives are really the ones that need our help from a conservation point of view. I still love I still love honeybees, but those are kept by beekeepers in very managed containers and very managed environments. It's the natives that really need our help. So seeing that more than 95% of the bees we saw on this flower were native, that was really, really exciting. Creeping thyme, very teeny tiny blooms. We figured great food for smaller bees, and no surprises here. There's going to be no, redirection here. Just tons of teeny tiny little bees on creeping thyme. What is really exciting is that these flowers bloomed really late into the year. So when I was a student, we saw this blooming primarily in August and September. Weirdly enough, the longer the drought keeps going, the longer we're seeing creeping thyme persist. It's October 2nd. I saw creeping thyme in bloom today, but I also saw it blooming in like the end of June and early July, where it's been a weird year. Maybe the conditions are changing as the climate change is making it more amenable to what creeping thyme needs to bloom for a longer period of time. So if there's one thing that I want folks to remember about this flower, is that it's the latest to bloom of all the bee lawn flowers, which is super important to pollinators. If you think back just 2 quick months ago to what your gardens looked like at the start of August, I bet everyone had loads of blooms in their garden, and that tends to be the case for Minnesotans in the summer. There's no shortage of flowers that bloom in June, July, and August. But as the year wanes on, there's fewer and fewer blooms out there in the landscape, but there are still bees active. There are certainly bees active today, so they need food. So the fact that you can incorporate a flower into your lawn that'll bloom late into the year, that provides high value to pollinators. Dutch white clover is one where nothing too fancy here. The sheer diversity of pollinators that are supported by Dutch white clover is incredible. We see small bees, we see large bees, we see solitary bees, we see gregarious bees like this beautiful bumblebee here. We also see honeybees. So I mentioned before, they are not the number one bee that we're kind of concerned with in our landscape. That being said, they're here and they're going to eat just about anything. They are generalist bees. They don't care if you plant only natives, they'll eat it. They don't care if you plant only non-natives, they'll eat it. They're going to visit just about everything. So having a flower that can support honeybees and native bees alike does provide tremendous value. Where Dutch white clover is a critical source of forage for honeybees and native bees alike. If any of you like wildflower honey, a whole lot of that comes from Dutch white clover. And if any of you like an easy way to support bees in your landscape, clover is also great for that. From my end of the spectrum, I'm always looking for new flowers to include. If I can get a pound of a flower at a wholesale rate for $50, I'm doing backflips. As more and more folks like you want flowers like self-heal in the landscape, more and more growers are producing it, and it really has helped to drive the cost down in a big way. I would say self-heal costs less than half of what it costed just 5 years ago, and that's all due to people like you that are saying, hey, you guys go out there and grow it. But even still, Dutch white clover is the king. We can get a pound of Dutch white clover at pretty much any garden center in the state of Minnesota for like $10. Dutch white clover, super cheap. And it's really great to have something that's accessible to lots of residents. When I tell folks to go out there and plant 100 pounds of bee lawn for $1,250, tough sell. When I tell folks to go out there and plant a couple pounds of clover for $20, much easier sell. That being said, you do see increased bee diversity as you incorporate more flowers, where we saw more than 10% of all of the bees in the entire state of Minnesota on just these bee lawn flowers. Keep in mind, they only had 4 test sites, all located in Minneapolis, so it's probably an even higher number than that. The fact that we saw this many bees is incredible. 65 bees is a ton. We would have been thrilled if we saw half of that number. So that covers the original bee lawn mix. Something that's really exciting is I work for the best boss in the world. I don't just say that because his cousin's here today. But when I signed on with Twin City Seed, I told my boss, his name is Paul, this is something that I want to dive deeper into. I think we're just scratching the surface. And he said, go nuts, where pretty much if I look at a flower and I say, I think this will be fun, he sleeps on it for an hour and then he buys way more than I ever anticipated. So we found some new flowers that work really well within the bee lawn, yak yarrow and blue-eyed grass. I'll talk about those really quickly. And here with this native bee lawn mix, we're trying to follow that basic rule of thumb, native plants support native pollinators. So yak yarrow, this is probably the one that I'm most excited about, where it is just so low input, where for me, being providing nutritional value to pollinators is half the battle. Super important, but to me, just as important is maintaining that low input goal. I want folks to be able to water less, mow less, and provide less nitrogen in their yard. And I don't think there's a flower out there that has stronger drought tolerance than yak yarrow. It is absolutely incredible how little this flower needs to survive. So it's great for bees. It provides exceptional drought tolerance. I used to say that it blooms at 6 inches. The grower that I was working with out in the Pacific Northwest said he thought he saw it as low as 6 inches. I have definitely seen it way lower than that. If you are thinking yarrow and thinking to yourself, the yarrow in my yard is 2-3 feet, this is a subspecies of the same species of yarrow. So there's common yarrow, which is just Achillea millefolium. This is Achillea millefolium var. occidentalis. If any of you are thinking, wait, is this a cultivar? It is not. All cultivars will have that single quote around it. Naturally occurring subspecies are just a variation. So they occur all the time in nature. This is just one of them where folks continue to grow it because they like that low cut of height of cut. Me, since I work in the lawn space, I love a low height of cut. So this is a flower that's becoming more and more popular. You know, I would say 2 years ago, we had to dig to try and find growers that had it. Now it's all over the place. Some nerdy stuff real quick. There are people who test the aesthetic quality of vegetation. Normally it's turf grass. This is a study from the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program. One of the studies that they do, which is going to be more interesting to you guys, is what they call low input evaluations. What vegetation does good when you pretty much ignore it? Yak yarrow was one of the top performers. I love Dutch white clover. When I adopt a female dog, I've already gotten the thumbs up to name her Clover. Yak yarrow blew the doors off of clover in these low input evaluations. So if you're looking for a flower that you can kind of just set it and forget it in your yard, yak yarrow is a great option. Blue-eyed grass. A picture is worth 1,000 yards. This is a beautiful flower. Pollinators love it. Songbirds love it. The one thing that just irks me a little bit is it's not nearly as low input as that yak yarrow. I would bet that, you know, some of you or you know someone who grows this in their garden. It's a little bit of a picky flower. It's got a narrow bloom window. It likes its moisture. But if you're willing to put those inputs in there, you can get this to grow within a lawn setting. I've actually also seen this one at a state park in Minnesota. Some additional advantages of bee lawns. If any of you like to support local growers, I love my local farmers market, so I definitely fall into this category. There's a really great study that's now 6 years old out of the Chicago area, where they found that if folks convert just 5% of their yard to any pollinator-friendly alternative, there is a noticeable improvement in pollination in urban gardens and urban farms. So if you want to help those folks improve yields, think about where you can incorporate some of these flowers. So I'm going to try and really bust through the installation side of things. If anyone has questions, feel free to email me. But I know we're trying to not go too late past 7 or 8 o'clock here. I forget which one it is. But I can still go through these quickly. So with regards to timing, you can do them in the spring. You could do them in the summer. You could do them in the late summer, or excuse me, you could do them in the spring. You could do them in the late summer, the transition from summer to fall, or you can do them in the late fall as a dormant seeding. Really, what I try to do is beg folks not to plant these in the middle of the summer when it's 95 degrees out and you'd have to water them 6 times a day just to get them going. When it comes to bee lawns or really establishing anything from seed, all the effort is in year one. If you can get them off the ground, you're in the clear. So trying to do these at the right time when it's a little bit cooler out or when we're heading into a winter dormancy, that's going to do so much better than trying to plant these in the middle of July when it's 95 degrees. You can establish these from both an overseeding or as a new lawn renovation. If you want to do this as an overseeding, there's a couple of things you need to think about. One, what kind of grass do I have in my yard? If you have Kentucky bluegrass or fine fescue, you're good to go. The other thing to think about is how much weed pressure is in this yard. Weed pressure is competition. The less competition, the better. If you have some really aggressive creeping Charlie in there, it's going to choke out just about anything you try to establish from seed. So really think about what your lawn looks like and whether or not it's a good candidate for an overseeding. Truth be told, most of them are, especially if you can keep those weeds in check. If your yard is less than like 1/3 weeds, I'd say you're good to give it a go. If you have a really weedy yard or you have some other turf grass species present in that yard, then you might want to consider doing a new lawn renovation if you want to get a bee lawn going. So how an overseeding works. Step 1, you mow that lawn area as short as possible. Step 2, you rake away the clippings, where the goal through steps 1 and 2 is to expose as much soil as possible. Then you throw the seed down. Sometimes it's good to mix it in with a little bit of soil as a bulking agent and also give the seed kind of a nice, light, fluffy little layer to establish into. And then the most important thing by far is to keep the area moist. One of the biggest issues that I ran into when I started doing these presentations is I said that bee lawns are very low input. You don't have to worry about watering them too much. The one qualifier to that is you absolutely have to water plants as they're getting established. If you can water these twice a day for the first 2 weeks, you'll be in the clear. 2 5-minute waterings per day for the first 2 to 3 weeks, and you're good to go. When it comes to maintenance, let them grow a little bit taller. I try to set my mower height to 3 inches, if not a little bit taller than that. Give them one little trim back in the fall, even if you want to mow as little as possible. And I only include this last part because I've seen folks fail to abide by this. Please do not apply herbicides to a bee lawn. Those herbicides can't tell flower you want from flower you don't want. They will absolutely kill your bee lawn flowers. I see the nodding of a very sad extension agent who's probably had to explain something like this before. So if you have suboptimal turf grass conditions, what do? Then you're going to be in line for a new lawn renovation. It is going to be a little bit more effort or a little bit more of an investment. But the good thing here is that you'll see improved overall results where you will get perfect seed to soil contact ratios because you're dropping that seed directly on the soil. So the first step here, of course, is going to be removing the turf grass or the vegetation in your yard that you want to replace with a bee lawn. You can do these through mechanical means, by hand with a shovel or a sod cutter. I used to work on the install end of these for all sorts of different garden projects. If it's more than 25 square feet, I don't think I'll ever use a shovel again. That little $20 rental has saved me countless hours in my life. I see some nods. If you haven't done one before, the next time you do something where you need to tear out turf, I'll give you the $20. And if you don't like it, you don't have to give it back to me. If you're doing a large area where maybe you're measuring the project in hundreds of square feet, again, I always think renting machinery is going to be worth your while if you have the means to do so. Renting a sod cutter like this is going to be more in the range of $100. But if you're doing a large project, it's going to save you so much time and so much effort. And even on the more industrial scale, when we're maybe measuring projects in thousands of square feet, we'll go as far as to rent a mini excavator, a little dingo. And that, takes all of the effort out of the equation. But of course, it's more expensive to rent. If you're looking for some organic site preparation methods, I'm going to quickly breeze through a couple of them. The first one that I'll talk about is a solarization. A solarization is where you cover the vegetation in a black or clear plastic, and you let it go for somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 16 weeks. So 2 to 4 months. It'll vary based on how much direct sunlight the area receives, where essentially the vegetation underneath is going to get cooked to a point where it can no longer survive. You let it cook. You eventually peel back the plastic, rake away the vegetation. At that point, I do like to add a little bit of compost or some sort of soil amendment to help improve soil quality. And then you just put down your seed for bee lawn, wildflower prairie, whatever seed you want to use, where this same prep technique can be used for any planting from seed, or really any planting at all. You could go ahead and throw plugs in there after this. The other method that I'll talk about is sheet mulching. I know that the still president, even if he's out of country, Robert Hadlevig is a big sheet mulching guy. But what you do is you mow the area down real low, and you kind of create what I affectionately call a lawn lasagna out of the area with layers of compost and cardboard soaking in between. This will break down really nice, give you a beautiful substrate to plant into. Many folks will do a cover crop in year 1 through the first winter and then put down their desired planting, which can be, again, wildflowers or a bee lawn, whatever you choose. So I went through those two planting techniques, or excuse me, those two site preparation techniques really, really fast. You'll notice at the bottom of the slide, I put the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. By no means am I the inventor of these strategies. The Xerces Society has incredible guidebook all about organic site preparation. I think they've got like certainly more than a half dozen techniques in there. If you're someone who, maybe you don't have the back to put in that a ton of effort, and you don't want to go through the $1,000 investment of renting a mini excavator, and you want something that's still eco-friendly for how can I renovate my lawn, definitely check out the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and their guide to organic site preparation. I'll note that it's written by a Minnesotan, a fantastic ecologist. I bring that up because if there's one thing that I've learned about Minnesotans in my time being here, it's that they really do love the state of Minnesota and other Minnesotans. So support your fellow Minnesotan and read the fantastic guidebook that they've written here. In terms of actually seeding the bee lawn, yes, believe it or not, there is a science behind how you should seed a lawn. It's called a perpendicular seeding, where you spread half the rate walking north-south, half the rate walking east-west. So let's say, hypothetically, the seeding rate for a bee lawn is 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet, and you're doing a 1,000 square foot lawn. You spread 2.5 pounds walking north-south, you spread 2.5 pounds walking east-west, and that'll give you the best results. It's a good idea to lightly rake it into the soil. I found this out the hard way. I tried to do a bee lawn at a house I rented. 15 minutes after I put the seed down, there were birds eating the seed. Birds are not super duper smart. They don't have great object permanence. You hide the seed behind a little bit of soil, you'll be in the clear there. In terms of watering, which is the most important part of all of this, do one heavy watering to saturate the ground, and from there, light and frequent is the key. So at an absolute minimum, try and do it 3 times per week you're watering. Ideally, for the absolute best results, you'll water 2 times per day for the first 3 weeks. Just 5 minutes per watering, and you'll be in the clear. How to actually install these from a new lawn renovation. You remove the turf any way you can, whether it's a machine or a cultural method like that solarization, or even by hand if you're maybe doing a small test plot. Once I have the soil exposed, I will add a soil amendment as needed. One thing that I see some residents with maybe a little bit less expertise than yourselves making a mistake is there are folks who will just throw a nitrogen-based fertilizer at every problem that exists in their lawn and garden. A soil test is by far the best way to learn what your yard needs. If your yard is nitrogen deficient, go ahead, throw that nitrogen-based fertilizer out there. But if you're low in organic matter, if your pH is off, or if there's literally any other issue in your lawn besides a nitrogen or nutrient imbalance, there's probably a fertilizer that's better, a soil amendment that's better suited for your yard. They make them specific that are specific for dry soils. They make them that are specific for those difficult to work in clay soils. So learn more about your soil and select a soil amendment based on that. Please do not throw nitrogen and phosphorus out there just because. After that, you spread the seed out, lightly rake it in to help the seed settle in. If you can, cover it with a germination blanket. The university has been doing tons of research on this and kind of just more broadly about site establishment. Germination blankets help a ton. They keep your seed in place and they keep weeds out. That's going to be extremely valuable, especially if you struggle with a weed problem in your yard. Keep it moist. And again, the same maintenance as before. Cut high, trim it back in the fall. Don't use herbicides. Just a little cut sheet for you to refer back to. In the recording, comparing and overseeding to a new lawn renovation. And now the absolute shortest part of this presentation is the maintenance that's required for a bee lawn. So I said before, the effort, the grunt work really goes into getting these installed. Once they're in there, maintenance is super easy. Year 1 is going to be the most pressing time. Water frequently, ideally daily. Even after you get out of the initial establishment, through the first year, I would try to water at least once per week and maybe do a couple weeding events. Creeping Charlie, the bane of my existence. If you can keep it out of your lawn, your bee lawn flowers will absolutely thank you. And once you get through that, then we can start thinking about our regular mowing, our regular maintenance, years 2 through infinity. So with mowing, I'm going to beg you to do less mowing, to do less work in your yard. Rather than cutting from 3 inches down to 2 inches, which is what's considered the typical lawn care regime, if you let your lawn grow out to 6 inches and cut it back to 4, you will be mowing 2 to 3 times per year. You'll have more flowers in that lawn, and the bees will thank you. So please, please, please do less work. Fertilizer. I have never, ever, ever fertilized a bee lawn outside of getting it established. I have never fertilized a mature bee lawn, is what I'll say. A lot of that is due to the clover and me also not caring if I don't have the darkest green lawn on the block. The clover is going to do the nitrogen fixation. If you happen to use a bee lawn mix that doesn't have clover in it and you think your lawn's looking not quite up to snuff, maybe do a very small application of a nitrogen-based fertilizer, but nowhere near what you would do for your traditional turf grass lawn. Irrigation, probably the biggest part of all this, or the mowing, when it comes to making your lawn area more eco-friendly. All of the irrigation that you need for a bee lawn is once every 2 to 3 weeks. Maybe if we go through an extended period of drought and 90-degree weather, you hit it once per week. It seems like that's unfortunately becoming more frequent here in Minnesota. But the root systems of fine fescues are about 3 feet deep. The root systems of Kentucky bluegrass are about 8 inches deep. And because of that, you can water these lawns far, far, far less frequently. The one thing that you might have to add is 1 annual thatch removal per year. Your local small equipment shop will let you rent one of these. It's super easy. It takes just as long as a mowing event does, where what it does is there's this thatch layer, which is kind of decomposing plant material that's between your healthy lawn and your soil. Because we're letting these grow out longer, there's more of that decomposing plant material that can build up. So you dethatch once per year, maybe in the middle of May, and you're good to go. So we remove maybe 75% of the mowing and we add in one little dethatching, still a huge net benefit. And from there, I'll take any questions that you folks have. Okay. In the back, in the middle. Not that I know for the creeping time. And oh, yes, I'll repeat the question. So it was mentioned that these bee lawns, or particularly the creeping thyme, is deer resistant, where they don't like the smell and the taste of the vegetation of that creeping thyme. Is it also rabbit resistant? And unfortunately, no, rabbits is one that I don't have an answer to. In fact, I'll admit that rabbits love clover. So that being said, I'm yet to find vegetation that they don't love. So whoever figures that out, they'll be a very popular person at whatever university or research project they're doing. But unfortunately, no answers to rabbits there. It was the worst year of grubs that I can remember for folks in Minnesota. And the reason you have voles is because you have grubs. Voles eat grubs, grubs eat roots. So you will have more root mass in your lawns here. But the other side of the equation is that if you're only working with 8 inches of root, and grubs come in and eat it, it'll be very easy for them to eat through that thing. But there is a chance that you could potentially attract more grubs. Quite frankly, I think that the grubs are going to come anywhere where there's roots, where they eat roots of all plants, not just turf. And they've quite frankly been decimating Minnesota vegetation. The answer we got from the field day was we don't have any great answers yet. What we were told, but even this is imperfect, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, where they're saying it's a lot easier to treat for grubs and therefore voles in advance rather than finding out you have a grub problem and trying to treat. But of course, who wants to put down an insecticide before they need to? So it's something that Extension is working really, really hard on, and not just here in Minnesota, around the country. If you want to do something that will help you with catharsis but be not productive at all, you can get mad at Wisconsin, where they came through Wisconsin to Minnesota here. But no good answer to voles because we have no good answer to grubs yet. And, it is possible that since we're going to have deeper root systems, maybe there's more there's more potential to feed more grubs and therefore more voles. But it's a tremendous issue that everyone's struggling with. Okay, so what would you recommend for a hillside? So when it comes to a hillside, there's two big kind of stressors that we have to overcome from the human side, not necessarily environmental. One, it is really difficult and dangerous to mow a hillside. There are more mower accidents than you would imagine on an annual basis, a lot of them on hills because it's more work to mow a hill. And two, you want a grass that's deeply rooted. It'll allow them to set better in those hillsides. So the fine fescues are a great answer to both of those. They're deep-rooted plants, root systems of about 3 feet on average, but also because they grow so slowly, they allow you to reduce mowing to two to four times per year. So by far and away, the fine fescues are the most common application for a hillside. Some folks will even just operate them as a no-mow area and just do a little bit of reseeding as needed once every few years. And because fine fescues are the base of a bee lawn, you can absolutely do a bee lawn on a hillside. And you know what? I might as well address herbicides. In the world of herbicides, there are broad spectrum herbicides that kill everything and are super duper toxic. And I wouldn't use them unless I was forced to. And even if I was forced to, I would wear all sorts of protective equipment. And then there's also herbicides that are much more specific and selective and lower in toxicity. In fact, Iowa State University has this hilariously long, super comprehensive guide to herbicides and their toxicity to humans and wildlife. And one that grades out far better than, say, like a glyphosate is anything where the active ingredient is chelated iron. The most popular commercially available product for it is called Fiesta, the Spanish word for party. So I would say I think of herbicides as an absolute last resort. But if I am forced to that point where, let's say, I've just got weeds that are decimating my yard or garden, then I'm using the one that's less toxic is going to be my preferred answer. But that's all that to say. Prostrate knotweed, I'm not sure, but if they tell you to use an herbicide, try and go for one that's low in toxicity. Outside of those mows, outside of when you're applying seed, I would always mulch or leave the clippings. Those will bring nutrients back into the lawn as they decompose. So I think the number is that 1/3 of the nitrogen needed per year, I think the equivalent of a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, can be achieved simply by leaving or mulching your clippings and just letting them go. So another way to just never ever apply a nitrogen-based fertilizer again, you use a turf grass that doesn't need as much nitrogen, the fine fescues. You incorporate a little bit of clover, which is nitrogen fixation, and then you leave your clippings. You're getting a ton of nitrogen back in your yard without ever purchasing a bag of fertilizer. In the event that nitrogen is needed, Milorganite or any slow-release nitrogen would be better than just, those nitrogen blitz fertilizers that you might sometimes see marketed. What I often equate it to is sometimes these bodybuilders will ingest like hundreds of grams of protein a day, but your body can only actually use so much of that protein. The same goes for your lawn, where, throwing pounds of nitrogen all at once, the lawn can only actually use so much of it, and a lot of it can have the potential to run off. The slow release nitrogens make the nitrogen more available over a longer duration of time, which is much more sustainable. But Milorganite's a nice option. Sustain makes some really high quality organic fertilizers, which are great, all of which are slow release. So in the event that you do want to use a nitrogen-based fertilizer, those are some things to keep in mind. In the world of potted plants, there's going to be a much greater diversity of flowers that you can use. So these flowers, we have such a limited amount of them because we're mowing them, because we're walking in them. For potted plants, especially if you can, get a foot or two of root depth in there, there's a humongous world of options. Rain Check Philadelphia, which probably no one here has ever heard of, you shouldn't have heard of it. They install these like really cool stormwater plantings out in Philadelphia. And they have a really great list of native perennials that do well in, planter boxes, which is essentially just like very akin to the plants that'll do well in a pot environment. So I would say to check out their list, but, rather than having a half dozen species to choose from like you do within a bee lawn, you'll have a few dozen to choose from. So yes, the bee lawn plants will work great there, but you've got tons of options, including, more natives that have, support incredible diversity of bees. Comes to yarrow and clover alike, the biggest issue that I have seen is sometimes folks will like ignore seeding rates. We've seen folks at Twin Cities Seed try to plant Dutch clover like they would plant turf grass, 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet, when in reality for clover, half a pound is plenty for 1,000 square feet. For yarrow, a tenth of a pound is plenty for 1,000 square feet. Wildflowers get planted at very different rates than grasses, so just keep that in mind when you're planting. A couple ounces of that yarrow, of that creeping thyme, is plenty for 1,000 square feet. So, just be mindful of what you're putting into the lawn and keeping it at an appropriate seed rate. Sometimes folks are no herbicides ever, but my mindset tends to be more closer to like, don't let better be the enemy of best. If it means we're not using glyphosate and we're getting rid of something that's going to be a giant pain in your side, like a Canadian thistle, I think it's better than the alternative. So yeah, I agree with you. Give a shout out to a guy. His name is Tony West on the Rocks Farms. So what he found was that he's able to do fine fescue sod with Dutch white clover, which within itself is a tremendous achievement. The other flowers, the roots, they need to have deeper roots than what you can roll out for sod. So he encourages folks to buy those seeds separate, but you can buy rolls of Dutch white clover and fine fescue sod now where, 98% probably the sod grown in the United States is Kentucky bluegrass. So he's really been it's really impressive what he's been able to do there. So yeah, Tony West, WESP, on the Rocks Farms, shameless plug. What I'll say is aeration is at a minimum going to be a net neutral and has the potential to be an extreme net positive. It's all dependent on how compacted your soil is. So if you have super compacted soil, aerated, I'd say, go nuts with it. Sometimes I'll see folks rent an aerator, do one pass through the yard and bring the aerator back. While you've got that thing rented, do like 4 passes through your yard. You can't have too much flow of nutrients and water through your yard. So, really get your money's worth there. And the same goes if you're using a liquid aeration product or a granular aeration product. More shameless plugs. We carry one at Twin City Seed called C20. It works wonders for yards. We're getting folks from Maple Grove and Roseville, all those compacted clay soil areas, really improving their yards because of it. So if you are walking out there and it feels like concrete, you try to put a shovel through, you're barely getting the spade down there, definitely consider doing any form of aeration. The next time you go to Bachman's, say that guy from Twin City Seed says C20 works really well. Please, please, please carry it. We're like begging them to take it because they'd sell a whole lot more of it than we would. And, I'm showing them all the nerd graphs that I have on the product. Like, look at how much it improves. Look at how much it lessens soil bulk density, which is probably, a very exciting graph. Believe me. Nomo May has the absolute best intentions. People want to have fewer inputs in their yard and they want to support pollinators. Not mowing your yard for an entire month because of alliteration is not the best way to achieve those goals. So what I would say is if there's a month where you want to refrain from mowing, do it in the heat of summer when your grass grows more slowly in general. So turf grass is what's considered a C3 vegetation. It refers to how carbon is produced. It does the most photosynthesis when temperatures are between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. In May, we have a whole lot of 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit in Minnesota. So you don't want your turf grass to grow out to 15, 18 inches and cut it back to 3 inches. You never want to remove more than 1/3 the total height of your lawn. That's why I mentioned before, growing your lawn out to 6 inches and cutting back to 4 inches. It allows you to follow that rule of 1/3. Anything beyond that is a tremendous amount of stress on the lawn area. So cutting 15 out of 18 inches, that's more than 80% of the total lawn height. That's going to be extremely stressful. So I would say if you want to achieve the same goals of No Mow May, reducing inputs and supporting pollinators, one, intentionally include some more wildflowers throughout the entirety of your landscape. It doesn't have to just be the lawn. Bee lawn flowers, native wildflowers, trees and shrubs. I mean, if you think about where bees are feeding in the month of May, tilt your head up 45 degrees and look at the crabapple tree and all those beautiful blooming trees. They'll be up there in dozens rather than, the 2 or 3 dandelions that are out there. And if you want to reduce inputs, think about a lot of what we talked about today. If you have to do is buy grass species A, the fine fescues, instead of grass species B, the Kentucky bluegrasses, then you're, practicing low input conservation, not just for 1 month because of alliteration, but throughout the entirety of the, growing season. So I think, I mean, alliteration works. The state program is called Lawns to Legumes, not Lawns to native pollinator friendly wildflowers. So we're trying to rebrand it as Slow Mo Summer. I did a seminar thing with the university about it. So let's try to make Slow Mo Summer pop. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So and yeah, and Mr. Extension over there knows you can't just go out and crap on things. You have to be politically correct. Yeah. So fine fescue is actually like an umbrella under which there are a few different species. So there's sheep's fescue, there's creeping red fescue, there's hard fescue, and there's hard chewings. Chewings is the one that I named that I forgot, and creeping red. So anything that oh man, we do let me go actually go to the labels where I think we do have the common names on those labels here. The question is, how do we know that a grass species is a fine fescue? There are 4 fine fescues, and we're going to talk about them. So let's see. And I'm going to share the screen here so that the folks on Zoom aren't just hearing me talk through it, so they can actually see what I'm talking about. And here we go. Okay. So the Latin names for all of these genus are going to be Festuca, but we also put the common names on there. So if it says creeping, chewings, hard, or sheep, you're in the clear. And of course, these fescues are also going to be a pretty good indication. Unfortunately, the turfgrass world couldn't make it easy on us. Of course, there's another kind of fescue out there that doesn't work with B-lawns. Those would be the tall fescues. I mean, your best bet is talk to whoever's at the garden center if you're not sure. But creeping, chewing, hard, and sheep are always going to be fine fescues that work really nicely with B-lawn flowers.